In the cold darkness of space, there exists a fear so profound that even the most battle-hardened warriors of the Valorian collective speak of it only in whispers. It is not the fear of extinction, for species have conquered that anxiety long ago through genetic engineering and neural backup systems. It is not the fear of poverty or suffering, for advanced civilization has abolished such primitive concerns. No, this fear runs deeper than anything civilization has managed to suppress. It is the fear of an opponent that refuses to die, that laughs in the face of weapons designed to obliterate, that stands back up when every logical calculation suggests they should remain fallen. The Valorians, Shrell, Ketharu, and dozens of other interstellar powers have learned this lesson through blood and defeat. But Captain Zalthos of the Valorian Collective would learn it more intimately than any commander before him, and that knowledge would break something fundamental in his understanding of warfare, victory, and survival itself. The dropship's descent burned the atmosphere of Kepler 442b with the heat of 1,000 suns, a crimson streak across a pale blue sky that screamed of invasion and conquest. Captain Zalthos stood in the deployment bay, his forearms crossed in patterns that indicated supreme confidence mixed with routine tactical awareness. His sleek obsidian exoskeleton reflected the red emergency lighting, and his compound eyes, massive and multifaceted, locked onto the descent timer with the precision of a being who had overseen the subjugation of 17 worlds. The planet below was supposed to be nothing more than a resource extraction point. Intelligence reports indicated a single dominant species, bipedal, relatively primitive in nature, with an average lifespan of barely 9 decades. Their weapons technology topped out at rapid-fire projectile weapons and basic energy weapons. Their genetic makeup showed them to be fragile creatures, susceptible to temperature extremes, requiring constant replenishment of atmospheric oxygen, vulnerable to radiation, and dependent on a complex biochemistry that could be disrupted 1,000 different ways. On paper, they were insects. In practice, they would be erased from this world within a solar cycle. Zalthos had brought 4,000 elite soldiers for the operation. 4,000 might have seemed like overkill for such a primitive species, but the Valorian Collective had learned through centuries of expansion that underestimation was the only true tactical failure. 4,000 would ensure overwhelming superiority. 4,000 would guarantee that not a single primitive could mount any meaningful resistance. The dropship's landing struts touched red regolith, kicking up clouds of mineral dust that scattered across the barren landscape. Through the reinforced view screen, Zalthos could see the first of the human settlements in the distance, crude structures of metal and composite materials arranged in what passed for a defensive perimeter. He allowed something approximating a smile to cross his mandible-like mouth. The humans had actually prepared defenses. How quaint. "All units deploy immediately," Zalthos commanded. His voice transmitted instantly across the entire invasion force through neural-linked communication channels. "Secure a 2-kilometer perimeter around all settlements. Rules of engagement are standard. Eliminate all resistance. Secure genetic samples of the dominant species before termination of the indigenous population. Beginning in 6 hours, we initiate systematic resource extraction. Any human found outside designated containment zones will be executed." The deployment was flawless. Zalthos watched from the command platform as his soldiers flowed from the dropship in coordinated waves, their weapons raised, their armor gleaming with the patina of 1,000 previous conquests. They moved with mechanical precision, every movement calculated by artificial intelligence assistance, every tactical decision optimized for maximum efficiency. They were the cutting edge of Valorian military superiority, and they faced humans who still died when their hearts stopped beating. The first human Zalthos personally encountered was during the initial advance toward the primary settlement. The creature emerged from one of the crude structures, bipedal as expected, with dark skin that suggested heavy melanin production. It wore body armor constructed from what appeared to be layered composite materials over a form-fitting undersuit. In its upper appendages, hands Zalthos recalled from the cultural briefing. It wielded a projectile weapon of surprisingly competent design, though obviously centuries behind Valorian technology. The human raised its weapon and fired. The projectile struck 3 Valorian soldiers in the chest. Kinetic rounds at the soldiers' personal shielding absorbed with casual efficiency. The barrier generators flickered slightly, indicated by the haptic feedback through their neural interfaces, but nothing more. The humans' projectiles were less effective than a minor annoyance. One of Zalthos's soldiers raised an energy weapon and fired a concentrated beam of ionized particles at the human. The beam struck the creature's center mass, a direct hit that should have atomized its organs and left nothing but a charred corpse behind. Xalthos watched on his tactical display as the energy bloom dissipated. Where the human had been standing, there should have been nothing. Instead, the human staggered backward, a massive burn across its torso, but it was still moving, still breathing, still raising its weapon. Xalthos actually paused processing for a moment, a phenomenon that his superior officers had always criticized him for. This almost organic hesitation in the face of the unexpected. The human should have been dead. The energy calculation was irrefutable. A being composed of water, carbon compounds, and a few minerals, exposed to that level of thermal radiation, should cease to function. Yet it did not cease. The human fired 3 more projectiles, then dropped its weapon and charged directly at the Valorian soldier who had shot it. The creature's actions made no tactical sense. It was wounded, clearly in pain based on the behavioral indicators, yet it approached with obvious intent to engage in close-quarters combat with a being twice its size and clad in armor. Xalthos's soldier met the charge with a sweep of its lower appendage, a move designed to incapacitate. The human flew through the air from the impact and struck the ground with force that would have shattered most biological structures. But instead of remaining down, instead of ceasing to function, the human rose back to its feet. Blood poured from the wound on its torso, from where its head struck the ground, from multiple points where the Valorian soldier's claws had torn into its flesh. Yet it rose. "Retreat," the human gasped in standard trade language, its accent thick and distorted. "Fall back to secondary defensive positions. I'm buying time." Then it charged again. Xalthos watched as his soldier engaged the creature in close combat, and for the first time in his military career, something shifted in his processing matrix. The human could not win. This was mathematically impossible. The Valorian soldier was faster, stronger, more durable, and better trained. And yet, as the Valorian struck again and again, as it inflicted wounds that poured blood and clearly caused the human intense pain, the human continued to fight. The human actually managed to land a strike, a punch that bounced harmlessly off the Valorian's armored shoulder. But in that moment, Xalthos processed something crucial. The human had been trying. The creature had attempted to drive its fist into what its primitive mind identified as a weak point. The human possessed tactical intuition, strategic thinking, threat assessment capabilities beyond what the briefing materials had indicated. It took 17 seconds for the human to finally cease movement. The Valorian soldier delivered a crushing blow to the back of the creature's head that resulted in severe cranial trauma. The human collapsed, and this time did not rise. Xalthos received the casualty report 90 seconds later. The human's delaying action had given the other inhabitants of the settlement time to flee into the underground cave system that the Geological Survey had identified. Of the 4,000 soldiers deployed, 7 had been killed by the resistance. 7. The human resistance had managed to destroy Valorian combat units in exchange for the lives of what appeared to be approximately 40 humans, which meant the kill ratio still favored the Valorian forces by a factor of 57-1. And yet, those 7 deaths bothered Xalthos in a way he could not quite process. "Pursue the survivors into the cave systems," Xalthos commanded. "Use seismic charges to collapse the caverns if necessary. The goal is termination of all indigenous life on this world. I want it completed within 8 hours." The pursuit proved more difficult than anticipated. The human resistance had retreated into a network of underground caverns that provided natural defense. Xalthos received updates every few minutes. More human casualties, but also more Valorian losses. The humans had placed explosive charges at strategic points within the caves, detonations that collapsed sections of the tunnels and entombed Valorian soldiers under tons of rock. The humans had set traps, crude devices of activated explosives triggered by basic pressure mechanisms that killed soldiers before they even had a chance to return fire. With each update, Xalthos noted a pattern. The humans were not running blindly. They were executing a coordinated defensive strategy. They had a commander orchestrating the operations, and that commander was making intelligent, adaptive decisions based on the flow of combat. The humans were learning. From moment to moment, they were processing what killed them and what didn't, and they were adjusting tactics accordingly. By the time the sun reached its zenith above Kepler, 442b, Xalthos had been forced to revise the casualty report. 342 of his soldiers were dead. The human resistance had been reduced to less than 200 combatants, but those 200 had managed to inflict casualties at a rate of less than 1 Valorian death per human death, a ratio that would be acceptable in most scenarios, but one that troubled Zalthos profoundly because it was based on the assumption that the humans were becoming less effective. They were not becoming less effective. They were becoming more effective. Zalthos made the decision to assault the primary cavern stronghold himself, a demonstration of command presence that would either rally his troops or provide the motivation necessary to break the human resistance. He descended into the caves with a contingent of his elite personal guard, their weapons charged, their shields at maximum capacity. The cavern was vast, a cathedral of stone lit by bioluminescent organisms and the glow of Valorian and human weapon discharge. The humans had dug in behind natural rock formations and constructed additional barriers from materials they had extracted and shaped. It was crude, it was primitive, but it was effective. The battle that followed would be recorded in Valorian military history as the Cavern of Kepler 442b, a moment where 700 soldiers engaged with less than 100 humans in close-quarters combat that lasted for 6 hours and resulted in the deaths of 283 Valorian soldiers. Among those dead was Captain Zalthos. Commander Velsath stood in the observation deck of the warship Valorian's Glory, 442b, with a sensation that her neural implants were struggling to classify. The planet turned below her, serene and beautiful in its pale blue hue, completely unaware that it had just become a graveyard for over 1,500 elite Valorian soldiers. The remaining forces under her command had successfully evacuated from the surface, but the cost had been staggering, incomprehensible, historically unprecedented. In 4,000 years of Valorian expansion, the collective had never experienced a complete military withdrawal from a target world. In 4,000 years, no species had ever forced a retreat from such a superior force. Yet here, on this remote planet orbiting an undistinguished star at the edge of Valorian-controlled space, an indigenous population of fragile, short-lived beings had accomplished the impossible. "Compile everything," Velsath commanded her tactical staff, her forearms making the gestures of authority and demand simultaneously. "I want a comprehensive analysis of every combat engagement, every casualty report, every communication from the surface. I want to understand what happened down there." The reports began arriving within minutes, and with each new piece of data, the picture that emerged became increasingly troubling. The human resistance had lost an estimated 980 combatants. The Valorian collective had lost 1,512 soldiers, roughly 150% of what the humans had lost. In any military calculus, this should have been an overwhelming victory for the humans. Yet it was classified as such, whispered through the encrypted channels of Valorian command with a tone that suggested something had fundamentally broken in the natural order of the universe. "How is this possible?" Velsath demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet of the command center. "We possess superiority in every measurable parameter: strength, speed, durability, intelligence, technology, training. How does a species that dies from simple thermal exposure manage to kill our soldiers at a higher rate than we kill them?" Lieutenant Commander Raul Ghosh, one of the few surviving officers from the ground invasion, stood before her with the 1,000-meter stare of a being who had witnessed something that violated his fundamental understanding of reality. Raul Ghosh had lost all 4 of his secondary limbs, reconstructed only 3 of them before deploying to the observation deck, and bore the scars of weapons that Velsath recognized from the combat logs. Human weapons, crude and inefficient, yet capable of wounding elite Valorian soldiers. "Commander," Raul Ghosh said carefully, as though speaking about something that might break if handled too roughly, "the humans do not process warfare the way we do. They do not calculate survival probability and retreat when the odds become unfavorable. They do not accept surrender as a legitimate option. They continue fighting even when their tactical situation is mathematically hopeless." "Humans are still subject to physical laws," Velsath replied, though, even as she said it, she understood that something in her statement was flawed. "They still require functional organs, intact neural tissue, adequate oxygen supply." "Yes, Commander," Raul Ghosh acknowledged. "However, my analysis of the combat footage suggests that humans possess remarkable regenerative capability. A human can sustain injuries that would incapacitate a Valorian soldier, yet continue fighting. A human can lose significant quantities of blood, experience severe trauma to internal organs, and still maintain combative function. I witnessed a human soldier strike by an energy weapon that should have caused immediate cessation of all biological functions. The creature's metabolism actually compensated for the cellular damage through emergency endocrine response. It survived the initial wound and continued fighting for 43 more minutes before eventual termination through cumulative trauma. Velsath processed this information carefully, running the data through her military analysis programs, searching for logical explanation or calculation error. There was none. The data was consistent, verified through multiple sources confirmed by independent analysis. The humans possessed a biological resilience that exceeded anything in the known galaxy. What about their genetic structure? Velsath asked, her mind already pivoting toward practical solutions. If we understand their biology, we can exploit it. Weaponized pathogens, genetic viruses, targeted biological agents. A junior tactical officer, barely more than a hatchling despite being nominally adult by Valorian standards, presented the genetic analysis. The human genome was remarkably simple in some ways, yet possessed extraordinary redundancy. Vital systems were duplicated throughout their bodies. Their neural structure was distributed, with significant processing capability in the brain, but also subsidiary neural networks throughout the spinal column and distributed nerve clusters. Their metabolism was devastatingly flexible, capable of operating under oxygen deprivation, extreme temperature variation, pH imbalance, and countless other conditions that would kill most biological organisms. And their healing factor. The junior officer's voice trembled slightly as he described the human capacity for tissue regeneration. Humans could replace lost blood volume, repair torn muscles, seal puncture wounds, and restore neural connectivity. The process was slow by Valorian standards, taking days or weeks, but it was remarkably efficient. A human who survived immediate catastrophic trauma had a probability of eventual recovery that was 20 times higher than any other known species. They evolve. Velsath realized suddenly, the insight striking her like a weapon. They have the ability to adapt to warfare in real time. Yes, Commander, the junior officer confirmed. Human soldiers demonstrate remarkable adaptive capacity. They analyze threat patterns, identify vulnerabilities in defensive tactics, and implement counter-strategies within minutes of battlefield experience. By the end of the engagement, human combatants had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in our formation strategy and weapon deployment patterns. It is as though their entire species is hardwired for learning during combat. The briefing continued for another solar cycle, each new piece of data confirming what Velsath had begun to understand. The humans were not primitive. They were not inferior. They were simply different, and that difference had manifested in ways that made them uniquely suited to survive warfare against even technologically superior opponents. Their fragility was offset by their malleability. Their short lifespans meant that evolution worked faster in their species, adaptive changes manifesting across generations rather than the hundreds of thousands of years that Valorian adaptation required. Their biological need for constant external resources made them creative at overcoming environmental obstacles. Their predatory ancestry meant they possessed intuitive understanding of tactics and strategy that had to be painstakingly taught to Valorian soldiers through institutional learning. By the time Velsath had finished processing all the data, a decision had formed in her mind. One that would change the course of Valorian history and send ripples through every major power in the galaxy. Dispatch a priority, one message to the Valorian Collective Council, Velsath commanded. Classify the humans as a tier. 1 existential threat. Recommend immediate implementation of containment protocols and establishment of a 20 light-year exclusion zone around their home system. No military action against human forces is authorized without explicit sanction from the Council itself. For all intents and purposes, treat them as a species on par with the Ketharu Dominion or the Shrell Collective in terms of military capability. The tactical staff went silent. The recommendation was almost incomprehensible. The humans represented less than 1% of Valorian territory. They had no spacefaring capability, no known presence outside their home system, no technology that advanced. And yet, Velsath was recommending that the entire Valorian collective treat them as though they were one of the known great powers. Also, Velsath continued, begin immediate research into human military doctrine. I want to understand how they think, how they fight, how they achieve victory against superior forces. And most importantly, I want to understand what makes them refuse to die. The message to the Council reached the capital world within weeks, transmitted at light speed through countless relay stations. The response came back just as quickly: approval. The Valorian Collective would indeed establish an exclusion zone. No further military operations were approved. The humans would be left alone. But the research continued. Velsath herself became obsessed with understanding the species that had defeated her invasion, had killed her soldiers, had forced the Valorian collective to acknowledge that perhaps there were limits to their dominance. She absorbed everything the reconnaissance drones could gather about human civilization, their history, their culture, their methods of warfare. What she discovered terrified her in ways that her programming was not equipped to handle. The humans had not even deployed their entire military force against the Valorian invasion. The soldiers on Kepler 4042b had been a small contingent, maybe 5% of the total human military apparatus. If they had been willing to fully mobilize, if they had brought their entire strength to bear, the casualty ratio might have been reversed entirely. And more than that, Velsath came to understand that humans did not fear death the way other species did. For them, mortality was not a problem to be overcome, but a fundamental condition of existence. They had structured their entire civilization around the acceptance of this mortality, creating meaning and purpose within the context of their brief lifespans. That context gave them something that no amount of genetic engineering or technological advancement could provide to the Valorian collective. They had nothing to lose. Velsath recorded her final analysis for the historical archives. Her voice was steady, but her neuroimplants registered stress levels that the medical systems flagged for attention. The humans will represent the greatest strategic challenge the Valorian collective has ever faced, not because of their current capabilities, but because of their capacity for growth. Every conflict they engage in teaches them something new. Every battle they survive makes them stronger, more resilient, more dangerous. If the collective ever makes the mistake of engaging them again, we must do so with the full understanding that we may not win, and that their species will continue to adapt, to evolve, to become increasingly difficult to kill. They are, by definition, impossible to kill. And that impossibility is becoming their greatest strength. 15 years passed on the galactic stage, and in that time the universe learned to fear humanity in a way that transcended traditional military calculus. The humans of Kepler 442b did not attempt to hide the story of their victory against the Valorian invaders. Instead, they broadcast it everywhere, across quantum-entangled communication networks, through diplomatic channels, via every available medium of information transfer. The message was clear and consistent. We survived. We fought superior technology, superior strength, superior numbers, and we won. The effect on galactic politics was seismic. The Shrell Collective, who had been aggressively expanding their territory, suddenly became cautious about probing Valorian space. If the Valorians, with all their technological prowess and military discipline, could not suppress a single world of humans, what did that mean for species that might find themselves in conflict with these resilient creatures? The Ketharu Dominion, always pragmatic in their approach to expansion, began researching human culture and biology with unprecedented focus. They wanted to understand not just how humans fought, but why they fought with such apparent indifference to personal survival. The humans themselves had been transformed by their victory. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, the human governments had unified for the first time in their recorded history, putting aside centuries of national rivalries and ideological differences. The species that had nearly destroyed itself in internecine conflicts suddenly possessed a unified purpose to ensure that never again would an external force attempt to conquer or exterminate their kind. To that end, they accelerated their technological development at a rate that had never before been achieved. Within 10 years, the first human spacecraft reached beyond their home system. Within 12, they had established permanent settlements in 3 neighboring systems. Within 15, they had begun constructing military vessels of their own design. Ships that incorporated both human engineering philosophy and tactical doctrine learned through hard experience against the Valorians. Admiral Marcus Chen stood on the observation deck of the human vessel Herald of Earth, watching the approach of a Ketharu diplomatic envoy. The visual feed showed a sleek alien warship, elegant in its design, powerful in its weaponry, and despite all of that, clearly uncertain about the encounter ahead. Chen smiled slightly. This was the new reality of galactic politics. Everyone was uncertain around humans now. Chen himself bore the scars of Kepler 442b, literally and figuratively. His left arm was reconstructed after the invasion, replaced with biomechanical augmentation that was more advanced than what the survivors had originally possessed. His right eye was cybernetic, replacing the one lost to shrapnel during the final cave battle. He had witnessed the deaths of friends and soldiers who had stood beside him in those desperate final hours, had held the hand of a young soldier named David Okafor as the injuries from enemy fire became too severe to overcome even human resilience. He understood more deeply than almost anyone alive that victory had not been free. Admiral Chen, his communications officer, called out, "The Catharu vessel is hailing us. They're requesting a formal diplomatic meeting." "Invite them aboard," Chen replied. "Show them that we are willing to meet with honor, that we respect strength, and that we fear nothing." The words were carefully chosen. The Catharu, Chen knew from the intelligence briefings, valued honor above almost everything else. They would respect a species willing to extend genuine hospitality to potential adversaries. And the second part was crucial. Humans would not cower, would not show deference beyond what was needed for peaceful relations, would not display the kind of uncertainty that other species had begun to show around the galaxy. When the Ketharu delegation boarded the Herald of Earth, they were met by Admiral Chen in full ceremonial uniform, flanked by human soldiers in combat gear. The display was calculated. Respect for the diplomatic mission, but clear message about military preparedness. The lead Ketharu diplomat, a being named Thelkar who had apparently fought in battles against the Shrell, assessed the scene with visible wariness in his compound eyes. "Admiral Chen," Thelkar said in standard trade language, his accent crisp and precise. "I am honored to meet with you. I have read the accounts of Kepler 442b. Your species accomplished something unprecedented. They told us it was impossible." Chen replied directly. "They had superior technology, better armor, more advanced weapons systems, greater strength. By every calculation that matters in conventional warfare, we should have lost. We lost 980 soldiers out of 1,000, but we survived, and they did not. I think your government is here because you want to understand how that happened." Thelkar's body language shifted slightly, a movement that the human linguistic analysis team had taught Chen to recognize as surprise. The Cathar rarely encountered beings who spoke with such directness. "Yes," Thelkar admitted. "The Catharu Dominion wishes to understand the human approach to warfare and survival. We are interested in establishing trade relations and possibly mutual defense agreements." "Let me tell you something," Chen said, moving to stand before the observation window that looked out onto the stars. "The Valorians believed that superior technology would guarantee victory, that more advanced weapons, better armor, and enhanced physical capabilities would be enough to overcome any resistance. They were not entirely wrong. If we had faced them in open field combat, if we had fought according to their rules, they would have destroyed us. But we learned that warfare is not decided by the quality of your weapons or the strength of your soldiers. It is decided by how willing you are to continue fighting even when winning seems impossible. It is decided by your ability to adapt, to learn, to accept losses and find new ways to achieve your objectives. It is decided by something that we humans have always possessed in abundance: the refusal to accept defeat." Thelkar processed this explanation, his neural implants visibly working through the implications. "You are suggesting that humans possess psychological characteristics that make you more effective in warfare than species with superior physical capabilities." "I'm suggesting something more fundamental," Chen said, turning to face the diplomat directly. "Every living creature is hardwired to survive, but humans have developed something else entirely. We have the ability to die for ideas, for principles, for the protection of others. We can sacrifice our own survival for the success of a larger group or objective." The Valorians could not comprehend this. They saw the human soldiers who charged into defensive positions with no hope of personal survival, and they thought it was irrational. It was not irrational. It was the highest form of rationality, understanding that sometimes individual survival is less important than group success. And when an enemy cannot understand your motivation, when they cannot predict your behavior through standard cost-benefit analysis, they lose the ability to effectively plan against you. The conversation continued for hours, and by the time the Catharu diplomatic delegation departed the Herald of Earth, the outlines of a tentative treaty were beginning to take shape. But more than that, Thelkar now possessed a framework for understanding humanity that would reshape the Catharu approach to interstellar relations. That evening, as Admiral Chen reviewed the preliminary treaty documents, a personal communication arrived on his secure channel. It was from an unexpected source, Commander Velsaf, still serving in the Valorian military apparatus. The message was brief, but carried significant weight. Admiral Chen, I have followed human development with great interest since Kepler 442b. I have come to understand that your species represents something that the Valorian collective perhaps does not fully appreciate. You are not simply a military threat or a strategic challenge. You are a fundamental question to everything the collective believes about victory and superiority. The Valorians believe in the primacy of strength, technology, and genetic superiority. Your species has demonstrated that these things, while valuable, are not determinative. In doing so, you have achieved something remarkable, not merely victory, but validation of a different approach to existence entirely. I wanted to communicate this personally, and to acknowledge that perhaps the Valorian collective was wrong about your species. Perhaps we should have attempted to learn from you rather than attempting to destroy you. Chen read the message 3 times, processing the weight of it. This was not an apology. Belsath was not formally authorized to offer such a thing, but it was something more valuable. It was acknowledgement. It was the beginning of understanding. Over the following decades, humanity's role in galactic affairs transformed completely. Where they had once been irrelevant, a minor species on a minor world, they became central to the calculations of the great powers. The humans became known for their adaptability, their resilience, their ability to learn from conflict and emerge stronger. Trade agreements flowed in both directions. Military alliances were offered and sometimes accepted. And perhaps most importantly, the great powers of the galaxy began to understand that strength was not measured solely in weapons or technology, but in the willingness to continue fighting regardless of cost. 10,000 humans traveled to the Valorian capital for a formal commemoration of the Treaty of Kepler 442b, a document that acknowledged the humanity of all beings and established protocols for peaceful resolution of conflicts between the major powers. Admiral Chen walked through the crystalline halls of the Valorian Grand Council with soldiers flanking him, and the eyes of 1,000 beings from 100 different species followed his movement. When asked by a news interface how he felt about the achievement of interstellar peace, Chen paused for a moment. He thought of the soldiers he had lost on Kepler 442b, of their names and faces, and the moments they had given their lives for others. He thought of the Valorian soldiers who had died on that same battlefield, equally brave, equally dedicated, equally victims of a conflict that neither side had wanted, but both had fought with everything they possessed. "We're impossible to kill," Chen said finally, his voice calm and measured. "Not because we're physically more resilient than other species. There are thousands of beings stronger and faster than humans. We're impossible to kill because we have learned that death itself is not the enemy. Defeat is not the enemy. Failure is not the enemy. The real enemy is the surrender of our will to continue, to fight, to adapt, and to ultimately triumph, not through overwhelming force, but through refusal to accept that triumph is impossible. That's what makes humanity impossible to kill. Not our bodies, our will." The statement was transmitted across the galaxy, captured and rebroadcast by 1 million different news services and communication networks. It became the defining philosophy of human expansion and human approach to survival. And slowly, carefully, other species began to adopt elements of this philosophy into their own cultures. The Catharu began to emphasize adaptability in their military training. The Shrell Collective introduced concepts of sacrifice and group cohesion that they had never previously valued. Even the Valorians, proud guardians of genetic superiority, began to invest resources in understanding human psychological training methods. In the end, Kepler 442b did not just produce a victory for humanity. It produced a shift in galactic consciousness, a recognition that maybe the things that made a species great were not always the same things that made them strong. And on a quiet world orbiting an undistinguished star at the edge of Valorian space, humans continued to be born, to grow, to live their brief lives with intensity and purpose, and absolute conviction that they would triumph. Not because they were stronger or faster or genetically superior, but because they had decided long ago that surrender was not an option, and that decision alone was worth more than all the technology and strength in the known galaxy. The universe had learned its lesson. Humans were not just warriors or conquerors or explorers. They were something more fundamental. A reminder that the will to survive and transcend was more powerful than any weapon ever constructed, more devastating than any military force ever assembled, and more impossible to defeat than any species had ever imagined possible.